In the glass-walled executive conference room of NeuroDyne Systems, a quietly brilliant engineer was about to face her biggest humiliation. What started as a routine board presentation took a shocking turn when she came face to face with systematic intellectual theft. Aria Lin wasn't your typical tech worker. For 3 years, she had spent her life building revolutionary neural interface technology in solitude, known for her obsessive precision and invisible genius. When she encountered VP Darren Voss dismissing her prototype as a parlor trick in front of 12 directors, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated erasure of her life's work. Aria's calm response, quietly uploading a single archived file to the company network, would lead to the complete unraveling of corporate deception. What began as public dismissal would become systematic restoration. The boardroom would never be the same after the truth emerged from 3 years of buried documentation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Glass walls of NeuroDyne's executive conference room caught the late afternoon light like a prism, casting angular shadows across 12 faces, arranged around the polished table. I stood at the head of the room, my prototype neural interface resting quietly in its aluminum case beside me. The device looked unremarkable, almost fragile against the backdrop of chrome and carbon fiber. But inside its simple housing lived 3 years of obsessive refinement. The interface operates on direct neural pathway translation. I began, my voice steady despite the weight of eyes on me. No physical contact required, no voice commands, no visual cues, just thought to action in real time. I opened the case and lifted the device, a slim headband. With microsensors that caught the overhead lights like dewdrops, the implications for accessibility, mobility, and human-computer collaboration are. Darren Voss interrupted with a laugh that echoed off the glass. Aria, let's pause there for a second. He leaned back in his chair at the far end of the table. His smile wide and practiced. This sounds fascinating. Truly, but we're talking about a market that doesn't exist yet for technology that he gestured vaguely at my prototype. Well, that looks like something from a student project. The room shifted imperceptibly, 12 directors turning their attention from me to him. Like flowers following the sun, I kept my expression neutral, but my grip tightened on the device. The beta testing shows 97% accuracy in controlled environments, I said, and the user adaptation curve is controlled environments. Darren repeated, his tone sliding into something almost paternal. That's exactly the issue here. Aria, this is academic overreach, not practical application. He stood up, smoothing his jacket. Our shareholders need solutions that work in the real world, not laboratory curiosities that require perfect conditions. Director Kelman from the Northeast Division nodded slightly. Darren has a point about market readiness, she said. What's the timeline for consumer deployment? I opened my mouth to respond, but Darren was already moving around the table toward my setup. The challenge with neural interfaces, he said, placing his hand on the table near my prototype, is that they sound revolutionary until you dig into the technical limitations. He picked up one of my documentation folder without asking. Signal degradation, environmental interference, user fatigue, the list goes on. Those issues have been resolved in version 7. I said quietly. The documentation shows. Documentation can show anything. Darren's smile never wavered, but implementation is where dreams meet reality. He set the folder down and turned to address the room. What Aria has built here is impressive research. Don't get me wrong, but research and product development are different disciplines entirely. The directors began murmuring among themselves. I watched their faces close off one by one, the initial curiosity replaced by the careful politeness reserved for presentations that wouldn't be moving forward. Dr. Imani Shuras sat 3 seats down from the head of the table. Her expression unreadable, but her eyes never left mine. Perhaps we should see the demonstration, Chairwoman. Kao's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and final. I nodded, gratitude flooding through me. The interface requires a brief calibration period, I said, lifting the headband. Approximately 30 seconds to map individual neural patterns. 30 seconds to map neural patterns. Darren repeated his tone, suggesting the very idea was absurd. And this works for everyone, or just people with specific brain chemistry. The adaptation algorithm adjusts for individual variants, I said, placing the headband carefully. It learns as it operates. I closed my eyes and felt the familiar gentle pressure of the sensors against my temples. The device hummed almost inaudibly as it synchronized with my thoughts. The room fell silent. I opened my eyes and looked at the wall display, then thought the command to activate it. The screen flickered to life, showing the neural interface diagnostic panel, wave patterns, scrolled across the monitor in real time, translating my thoughts into visible data. Presentation mode, I thought, and the display shifted to show a three-dimensional model of the interface architecture, rotating slowly in space. Several directors leaned forward, their interest rekindled, but Darren's laugh broke the moment again. Very impressive, he said, but parlor tricks don't build sustainable business models. He walked over to the display and gestured at the rotating model. How much did this demonstration cost to set up? How many hours of preparation? How many technicians? None, I said, removing the headband. Interface operated. Independently. Independently. He smiled that practiced smile again, but only in this room, with this specific setup, with these particular conditions. He turned back to the directors. I've seen similar demonstrations from IT, Stanford, Caltech. They're all fascinating and they all require perfect laboratory conditions to function. Director Martinez, from the Southwest Division, checked his tablet. What's the projected development cost for market-ready units? Darren answered before I could speak. Neural interface technology typically requires 10 to 15 years of additional research before commercial viability. He said, we're talking about hundreds of millions in development costs for a market that may not exist. When the technology is ready. I stood there holding my prototype, watching the directors nod along with his assessment. They weren't wrong to be cautious. Neural interfaces had been promises for decades, but I had solved the problems they thought were unsolvable. I had built something that worked not in 5 years, not with perfect conditions, but now in this room with nothing but thought. The cost analysis assumes traditional development pathways, I said. This interface uses a fundamentally different approach to neural translation. The manufacturing requirements are actually simpler than current consumer electronics. Darren's expression flickered for just a moment, something almost like annoyance crossing his features. Aria, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we need to be realistic about timelines and market readiness. He gathered my documentation folders into a neat stack. This is excellent research work, truly, but it's not a product presentation. Chairwoman Tao's voice cut through the tension again. Thank you, Aria, she said, her tone neutral. We'll review your materials and follow up accordingly. I nodded once and began packing my prototype back into its case. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, as directors checked tablets and phones. The presentation was over. Not with fanfare or approval, but with the polite dismissal reserved for ideas that wouldn't be pursued. As I gathered my materials, Dr. Shiraz caught my eye for just a moment. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, her expression still unreadable, but something in her gaze suggested she had seen more than the others noticed. I walked out of the conference room carrying my case and documentation. The elevator doors closed behind me and I stood alone in the descending car. My reflection multiplied in the polished steel walls behind me. NeuroDyne continued its day, but something had shifted, not in the building or the company but in the quiet space between what was said and what was understood. Back at my workstation, I opened my laptop and navigated to a folder I hadn't accessed in months, labeled simply Archive. Inside were time-stamped files, design iterations, voice memos and metadata spanning 3 years of development work. I selected a file named Interface Org V7 and uploaded it to the Executive Network shared drive. No message, no explanation, just the file itself sitting quietly in a folder that Darren and the directors would eventually find when they went looking for the research behind the next quarter's product launches. My apartment felt different that night, smaller somehow, as if the day's presentation had compressed the walls around me. I sat on my couch in the dark laptop, balanced on my knees, and played back the audio recording I had made of the meeting. Darren's voice filled the quiet space again, his laughter echoing off my bare walls. Parlor tricks don't build sustainable business models. I closed the audio file and opened my private backup drive folders within folders, each one time-stamped and labeled with the obsessive precision of someone who understood that memory could be rewritten by those with louder voices. Clicked through years of work sketches from coffee shop, napkins, voice memos, recorded at 3 a.m, detailed technical specifications that no one else had ever seen. The neural interface hadn't been born in NeuroDyne's labs. It had been born here in this apartment during long nights. Sleep felt less important than solving problems that shouldn't have been solvable. I pulled up a folder labeled Origin Docs and found the first sketch I had ever made of the neural pathway translation algorithm, dated 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, drawn on the back of a grocery receipt. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, but the content made my chest tighten. Check the logs under interface Orig, V7. Your name's still buried in the hash. It was signed with just 2 letters N. Eli Navarro. Eli had left NeuroDyne a year ago, quietly, professionally, with kind of resignation letter that said everything by saying nothing at all. He had been a senior systems engineer responsible for metadata and version control, the kind of work that made him invisible to executives, but essential to anyone who actually built things. I opened interface Orig, V, digging through the code comments and embedded documentation. The file was large, dense, with 3 years of iterative development. But Eli was right. Buried in the hash signatures and revision logs was a pattern of authorship that told a different story than the one Darren had presented to the board. Every major breakthrough, every solved problem, every elegant solution bore the same digital signature. Mine, the timestamps stretched back to the beginning, showing the evolution of ideas from concept to prototype to functional system. My name appeared in commit logs, design reviews, tech specifications, and code comments. Hundreds of times I pulled up another file from my private archive, a recording from 2 years ago, my voice tired but excited. Breakthrough on signal degradation. Figured out the adaptive filtering approach. If we modulate the sensor sensitivity in real time based on ambient neural noise, we can maintain accuracy, even in non-controlled environments. I paused the recording and checked the timestamp 2/7. On a Tuesday in March, the same Tuesday that Darren had announced at the quarterly review that NeuroDyne had achieved a major breakthrough in neural interface stability. I kept digging through archives and found the paper trail that told the real story of the last 3 years. Not Darren's version, where brilliant leadership guided junior researchers toward innovation, but the actual version where problems were solved by someone working alone in an apartment, code that no one else understood. There were the late-night emails I had sent to Darren, documenting progress, proposing solutions, asking for resources to expand testing. His responses were always brief, encouraging but vague. Great work, keep pushing. Interesting approach, let's discuss Monday. Sure, you document everything. I had documented everything, and now I understood why he had been so insistent about documentation. It wasn't for my protection or for the company's records. It was for his own insurance policy against the possibility that someone might question where the breakthrough had come from. My laptop chimed with another message, this one from Dr. Schurers. Would you be available for lunch tomorrow? We should discuss your presentation. No elaboration, no context, just the suggestion of a conversation that couldn't happen within NeuroDyne's glass walls. I replied with a simple yes, and then returned to the archives. I found audio files that I had forgotten, recording conversations with myself as I worked through problems. The key insight is that neural patterns aren't static. They're dynamic, which means the interface has to learn continuously, not just during calibration. Late-night epiphany that had become a core feature of the system. I pulled up Darren's patent applications filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. 6 months ago, the primary inventor was listed as Darren Voss with supporting contributions from the NeuroDyne development team, appeared nowhere in the documentation, but the technical specifications matched my archived designs almost word for word. The interface that he had dismissed as a parlor trick during the presentation was the same system that he had described in his patent filing as a revolutionary breakthrough in human-computer interaction with broad commercial applications. The same system that NeuroDyne's marketing team had been quietly incorporating into next quarter's product roadmap. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness thinking about the path that had led me here 3 years ago. Darren recruited me personally, calling me at MIT where I was finishing my doctoral work in computational neuroscience. "We need someone who understands how brains actually work," he had said, "not just the theory but the engineering reality." I had been flattered by the attention, excited by the possibility of building something that mattered. I turned down offers from Google, Microsoft, and 2 well-funded startups because Darren had promised something different. The chance to work on problems that no one else was solving with resources that academia couldn't provide. "You'll be the technical lead," he said. "Your name on the patents. Your vision driving the development." I had believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that brilliance without visibility was just invisible brilliance. Now, sitting in my apartment with 3 years of archived proof spread across my laptop screen, I understood the real arrangement. I had been the technical lead in the same way that a ghost is the lead character in a haunting essential to the story, but invisible to most of the audience. I opened a new email and began typing, "Dr. Shurkus." I wrote, "Thank you for the lunch invitation. I have some materials that might interest you regarding the neural interface project, specifically documentation that predates today's presentation." I attached a single file interface, a work of V7 with all its buried signatures and hidden histories. I didn't write an explanation or accusation, just the file itself sitting quietly in an email that would arrive in Dr. Shursh's inbox tomorrow morning. When she opened it, she would see what Eli had seen, what anyone with access to the real development logs could see if they knew where to look. My name buried everywhere in the system that Darren claimed to have conceived. Dr. Shursh's office felt different from the executive conference room, smaller, more human, with actual books on the shelves. Instead of just tablets and monitors, she opened the file I had sent and scrolled through the embedded metadata, her expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something that looked like anger. "How long has this been going on?" she asked without looking up from her screen. 3 years, I said, but the pattern became clear about 6 months ago when the patent applications were filed. She pulled up another window showing NeuroDyne's internal development timeline and began cross-referencing timestamps, every major milestone in the neural interface project. She said quietly, "They all trace back to your individual commits." She looked at me directly. "Darren knows this. He has to," I said. "He approved all the documentation requirements, insisted that everything be logged and archived." Dr. Shursh leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment outside her window. The city buzzed with its usual afternoon energy, but inside the office the weight of 3 years of systematic erasure settled between us. "There's something else," she said, pulling up NeuroDyne's internal messaging system. "We've been seeing instability in the core neural processing modules for the past 2 weeks. Random errors that the engineering team can't trace." She showed me the error logs. "They're all happening in subsystems that, according to the official documentation, were designed by Darren's team." I recognized the error patterns immediately. "Those aren't random failures," I said. "They're cascading from the handoff core module when the neural translation process hits certain edge cases. The error handling defaults to safe mode instead of adapt correction, and you know this because I wrote the error handling protocols," I said. "They're designed to fail safely, rather than risk user injury, but the current system architecture doesn't include the full adaptive framework. Dr. Schurz pulled up the system architecture diagrams highlighting the affected modules. If these failures escalate, they could cascade across the entire platform, she said. We're talking about potential recalls, field failures, customer safety issues. It won't escalate if the missing framework components are integrated, I said, but that requires understanding the original design intent, not just the surface-level implementation. She was quiet again, scrolling through more logs, more error reports, more evidence of a system that was slowly revealing its true authorship through the pattern of its failures. Darren asked for an emergent engineering review this morning, she said. He's been trying to identify the source of the instabilities. Has he contacted me? No, she said. He's been working with the official development team, the people listed in the project documentation. We both understood what that meant. Darren was trying to solve problems in a system that he didn't fundamentally understand, using people who had been told that someone else was the original architect. It was like trying to repair a building without access to the blueprints, while insisting that you had designed it yourself. Dr. Schurz closed the error logs and turned back to the metadata analysis. I need to ask you something directly, she said. Do you have complete documentation of the neural interface development, original designs, decision trees, implementation notes, everything? Yes, I said. Everything is archived with timestamps, digital signature, and version control, including audio logs, video recordings, technical specifications, including conversations with Darren, where he acknowledged my technical leadership, I said, before he decided that leadership meant something different. She nodded once, the kind of nod that suggested a decision had been made. The board is scheduled to review NeuroDyne's neural interface strategy next month, she said. Chairwoman Cao has been asking pointed questions about our technical capabilities, especially given the recent market developments. What kind of questions? Whether we have the internal expertise to execute on our roadmap, Dr. Schurz said. Whether our claimed innovations can be verified and defended. She paused. Whether the people presenting the technology actually understand how it works. I understood the implications. If NeuroDyne's neural interface technology became central to the company's growth strategy, the board would need confidence that the technical team could deliver on the promises being made, and if the current technical team couldn't explain or fix problems in their own system, that confidence would evaporate quickly. There's going to be a technical deep dive with the board, Dr. Schurz continued. Detailed presentations on architecture, implementation timelines, risk assessment. She looked at me directly. Darren will be expected to demonstrate comprehensive understanding of the systems he claims to have designed, and if he can't, then the board will want to know who can. She saved the files she had been reviewing and closed her laptop. I'm going to recommend that you be included in the technical review as a consulting engineer, someone who can verify the implementation details. It wasn't exactly vindication, but it was something. It was the beginning of a process that would force the truth into the light, not through accusations or confrontations, but through the simple requirement that people understand what they claim to have built. Dr. Schurz, I said, why are you helping me? She was quiet for a moment, looking out her window at the city beyond. Because 15 years ago, someone took credit for my doctoral research, she said, and I stayed quiet because I thought proving them wrong would be harder than just moving on. She turned back to me. I was wrong. Staying quiet just makes it easier for them to do it again. That afternoon, I received a calendar invitation for a technical review meeting with the board, scheduled for the following week. The meeting description was brief: comprehensive analysis of neural interface architecture, implementation status, and development roadmap. My name was listed as a consulting technical specialist. Opened my archive folders and began preparing, not for a presentation about what could be built, but for a demonstration of what already had been built. and by whom the files told a story that was impossible to argue with, not because it was dramatic or emotional but because it was simply true. Innovation, every breakthrough, every solution had a timestamp and a digital signature that traced back to late nights in my apartment, to voice memos recorded at 3 in the morning, to problems solved by someone who understood that building something real was more important than taking credit for it, until taking credit became the only way to prevent someone else from rewriting history. The cafe 3 blocks from NeuroDyne felt like neutral territory, all exposed brick and reclaimed wood, where conversations could happen without glass walls, amplifying every word. Dr. Schurz arrived 15 minutes late, carrying a leather portfolio that looked worn from years of actual use, not the pristine accessories that populated NeuroDyne's executive floors. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "and about the board review next week." She ordered coffee black and waited for the server to leave before continuing. "There's something you should know about Darren's position with the directors." I leaned forward, sensing something important in her tone. "His credibility has been questioned before," she said quietly, "not about intellectual property, but of technical depth." Chairwoman Ko asked him to explain the quantum processing framework during the last quarterly review, and his answer was, she paused, insufficient. "He couldn't explain how it worked," Dr. Shari said. "He gave a marketing overview, but when Ko pressed for technical details, he deflected to implementation timelines and cost analysis." She pulled a tablet from her portfolio. "She asked me to review his technical presentations after that meeting," showed me a document with her handwritten notes in the margins. Darren's last 3 board presentations marked up with questions and corrections. "Most of his technical claims are accurate," she said, "but they lack the kind of detail that comes from actually building something." She looked at me directly. "They read like someone describing a house they've toured, not a house they've designed." I understood what she was saying. Darren's presentations were polished, comprehensive, and completely surface level, like descriptions written by someone who had been briefed thoroughly, but had never held a blueprints. "The board review next week isn't just about the neural interface," Dr. Shars continued. "It's about whether NeuroDyne has the technical leadership to execute on the next 5 years of development." She flipped through more pages on her tablet. Ko specifically requested detailed architecture reviews, capability assessments, and risk analysis, and Darren will be expected to provide all of that. Darren will be expected to defend all of that, she corrected, to answer follow-up questions, to explain implementation details, to justify design decisions. She closed the tablet. "Kind of questions that require understanding, not just knowledge." I pulled out my own laptop and opened the folder I had prepared the night before. "I have everything," I said, "not just the neural interface, but 3 years of development documentation, decision trees, failed approaches, success solutions, and the reasoning behind every major design choice." Dr. Sharis looked at the screen as I scrolled through files, audio recordings of late-night problem-solving sessions, video documentation of prototype testing, detailed technical specifications that traced the evolution of ideas from concept to implementation. "This is comprehensive," she said. "This is the kind of documentation that proves deep understanding. It's also time-stamped, digitally signed, and cross-referenced," I said. "Every major breakthrough has supporting evidence that shows when it happened, how it happened, and who made it happen." She was quiet for a moment, studying the metadata. "Aria, what do you want from this?" she asked. "Vindication, recognition, compensation." I had been thinking about that question since Eli's message. Since the board meeting, since 3 years of watching my work attributed to someone else. "The truth to be visible," I said, "not just acknowledged but undeniable. And if that destroys Darren's career, then his career was built on something that wasn't his." I said, "I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to restore something." Dr. Sharis nodded slowly, The board review is scheduled for Tuesday, she said. Darren will present. First, comprehensive overview of NeuroDyne's neural interface capabilities, followed by preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Technical analysis. She paused. I can arrange for you to present immediately after as an independent technical consultant. What would I present? The same technical analysis, but from the perspective of someone who actually built the system, she said. Let the board compare the two presentations, draw their own conclusions. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity. It was the opportunity to stand in the same room where Darren had dismissed my work and demonstrate the difference between marketing brilliance and technical understanding, without accusations or confrontations. Just the simple presentation of facts. There's one more thing. Dr. Shires said, the system failures we discussed yesterday, they're accelerating the error logs from this morning's show cascade failures in 3 regional deployments. She showed me her phone with NeuroDyne's internal alert system lighting up with warnings. Engineering team is working on patches, but they don't understand the underlying architecture. How bad is it? Bad enough that Cow moved the board review up to Friday. She said, Darren has 3 days to present a comprehensive solution to problems in a system he claims to have designed. The error patterns on her phone recognizing the signatures of failures I had anticipated, and coded defensive measures for failures that were happening, because the current implementation was missing critical components from the original design. I can fix those failures, I said, but it requires access to the core modules and the authority to implement changes. And if you fix them, then it becomes very clear who understands the system, and who doesn't. Dr. Shires finished her coffee and gathered her materials. I'm going to recommend that you be given emergency consulting access to the neural interface codebase, she said, ostensibly to help resolve the current failures, but actually to document your familiarity with systems that officially you never worked on. We walked back toward NeuroDyne together, but separated at the lobby. She took the elevator to the executive floor, returned to my workstation. The building buzzed with the controlled urgency of people trying to solve problems they didn't fully understand, but in the quiet space between what was broken and what could be fixed, I began to see the shape of something larger than vindication. That evening, I received email with temporary administrative access to NeuroDyne's core neural processing systems, along with a brief note from Dr. Shars, emergency consultation, authorized by Chairwoman Cow. Please document all analysis and recommendations for board review. I opened the codebase and found exactly what I expected: a system built on my original architecture, but modified by people who understood the syntax, but not the logic, like a building constructed from blueprints that had been partially erased. The structure was sound but critical. Load-bearing elements had been removed or simplified beyond their functional capacity. I began documenting not just the errors but the missing components, the simplified algorithms, the removed safeguards, and the elegant solutions that had been replaced with brute force approaches. The more I analyzed, the more obvious it became that the current system was a degraded version of something more sophisticated. By midnight, I had compiled a comprehensive analysis of the failures along with detailed explanations of the original design intent and specific recommendations for restoration. It wasn't just a bug report, it was a masterclass in the difference between building something and maintaining something that someone else had built. I saved the analysis to the shared board review folder with a simple FAINmail, Neural Interface Technical Assessment, PDF. No covering letter, no executive summary, just the documentation that proved beyond question, understood the system well enough to fix it, and who didn't. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn energy that made NeuroDyne's glass towers look like monuments to precision, but inside the building panic moved through the corridors with the subtle persistence of a gas leak. The neural interface failures had cascaded overnight, affecting 6 regional deployments and triggering automated safety shutdowns that left thousands of users without access to critical systems. I arrived early and found Dr. Shars in her office surrounded by printouts of error logs and system diagnostics. Worse than we thought, she said without looking up. The failures aren't random, they're following a pattern that suggests fundamental architecture problems. I know, I said. I documented the pattern in my analysis. The system is trying to execute functions that require components that were simplified out of the current implementation. She pulled up my technical assessment on her screen and scrolled through the detailed explanations. This is graduate-level systems architecture, she said, the kind of analysis that requires intimate familiarity with design intent, not just surface-level debugging. Have you shared it with Darren? I forwarded it to him at 6 this morning, she said, along with Keo's request that he incorporate your findings into his board presentation. She looked at me directly. He hasn't responded. The board meeting was scheduled for 10, but at 9:30 Dr. received a message asking her to join a preliminary discussion in Keo's office. When she returned 20 minutes later, her expression had shifted from concerned to something closer to grim. Derman tried to dismiss your analysis, she said. He told Keo that external consultants often misunderstand internal system architecture, and that the failures could be resolved through standard debugging protocols. She sat down heavily. Keo asked him to explain the handoff core module failure pattern from your report, and he couldn't, she said. He gave the same marketing overview of neural pathway translation and adaptive processing, but when Keo asked about the specific error signatures, he said he would need to consult with his technical team. Which technical team, exactly? Keo's question, Dr. Shars said. She pointed out that according to the project documentation, designed these systems personally, which should mean he understands them well enough to debug them personally. I felt something shift in my chest, not satisfaction, exactly, but the recognition that truth had a way of surfacing when pressure was applied in the right places. There's more, Dr. continued. Keo asked me to attend the board meeting as technical advisor. She wants someone present who can verify claims and answer detailed questions. She paused. She also asked me to invite you as the consulting engineer who wrote the technical assessment. The boardroom felt different at 10 the morning than it had during my presentation. 3 days earlier, the same glass walls and polished table, but the energy had changed from routine review to crisis management. 12 directors arranged around the table with tablets displaying real-time error reports from the field deployments that were still failing. Darren stood at the head of the room with his usual polished confidence, but something in his posture suggested strain. The current system instabilities represent normal growing pains in any complex technical deployment, he began. Our engineering team has identified the root causes and developed comprehensive solutions. Chairwoman, Keo interrupted before he could continue. Mr. Voss, could you explain the handoff core module error pattern described in the technical assessment we received this morning? Darren's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. The handoff core managed neural signal translation between input devices and processing systems, he said. When load-balancing algorithms encounter edge cases, the system defaults to safe mode until optimal pathways can be re-established. It was a perfect marketing explanation, accurate in its terminology, but completely empty of actual understanding. Seo seemed to recognize this immediately, and what specific modifications to the load-balancing algorithms would resolve the cascade failures. Our technical team is implementing adapt threshold adjustments, Darren said, along with enhanced error recovery protocols and optimized pathway redundancy. More marketing speak, more accurate-sounding terminology that said nothing about the actual problem or its solution. Keo's expression remained neutral, but I could see her patience thinning. Ms. Linning, Keo said, turning to me, you authored the technical assessment we reviewed this morning. Could you explain the handoff core failures in more specific terms? I stood up and moved to the display screen, pulling up the error logs from my analysis. The handoff core failures occur when the neural translation process encounters input patterns that require dynamic algorithm selection. I said, the current implementation uses static threshold values, but the original design included adaptive threshold calculation based on real-time signal analysis. I highlighted specific sections of the error logs. When the system encounters neural patterns outside the static threshold range, it defaults to safe mode rather than adapting its processing approach. I said, the cascade failures happen because multiple users hitting edge cases simultaneously overloads the safe mode processing capacity. Director Kelman leaned forward, and the solution: restore the adaptive threshold calculation functions that were simplified out of the current implementation. I said, the original design anticipated this exact failure mode and included specific safeguards. KO looked between Darren and Mr. Voss. Do you agree with this assessment? Darren's pause lasted just a moment too long. The adaptive threshold approach has merit, he said, but implementation complexity and processing overhead make static thresholds more practical for large-scale deployment. But static thresholds are causing the failures, Director Martinez pointed out. Any complex system requires optimization, Darren said. Our team is exploring multiple approaches including adaptive thresholds, enhanced static ranges, and hybrid processing models. KO's voice cut through his response with surgical precision. Ms. Lin, how long would it take to implement the adaptive threshold restoration you described? 6 hours, I said. The original code exists in the archived versions, it just needs to be reintegrated and tested. The room went quiet. Darren's face remained composed, but something in his eyes suggested he was beginning to understand that the conversation had moved beyond his control. Mr. Voss, KO said, if the solution is that straightforward, why hasn't your technical team implemented it? System modifications require comprehensive testing and validation, Darren said. Rushing changes into production environments can create additional instabilities. But the current instabilities are affecting thousands of users, KO said, and according to Ms. Lin's assessment, they could have been prevented with proper implementation of the original design. She had moved from questioning Darren's solutions, questioning his understanding of the problem itself, and the difference was becoming obvious to everyone in the room. The board meeting ended with what KO called a technical implementation review, scheduled for the following week, but the real decision had already been made in the quiet space between Darren's marketing explanations and my technical specificity. The difference between describing a system and understanding a system had become impossible to ignore that afternoon. I received an email that changed everything. Not from NeuroDyne, but from the International Neural Compute Symposium, a formal invitation to present a keynote lecture on breakthrough approaches to neural interface architecture. The email was brief, professional, and signed by Dr. Elena Vasquez, the symposium's technical director. We received a compelling recommendation for your participation. The email read, specifically regarding your innovative work on adaptive neural translation systems, we would be honored to have you present your research to the international neural computing community. I stared at the screen, reading the invitation 3 times before the implications settled. The symposium was a premier gathering for neural interface researchers, attended by technical leaders from every major technology company, academic researchers and venture capital firms, focused on neural computing. It was exactly the kind of visibility that Darren had spent 3 years ensuring. I wouldn't have my phone with a text from Dr. Schwarz. Saw the symposium invitation in the shared calendar. Congratulations. I called her immediately. How did they know about my work? KO serves on their advisory board. Dr. Schwarz said, she's been asking very specific questions about NeuroDyne's technical capability and our contributions to the broader neural computing field. She paused. I believe she may have shared your technical assessment with the symposium's review committee, as an example of NeuroDyne's internal research, as an example of the kind of technical depth that the industry needs to see more. Dr. Schwarz said, the symposium is next Friday, the same day as our rescheduled board review. I understood immediately. KO had created a situation where my work would be visible to the global neural computing community, on the same day that NeuroDyne's board would be evaluating the company's technical leadership. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. That evening, I sat in my apartment, reading through 3 years of archived research, and began preparing a presentation that would tell the story I had never been allowed to tell, not about corporate politics or intellectual property theft, but about the actual work of building something that had never existed before. I started with the first sketch, drawn on a grocery receipt, the moment when I realized that neural interfaces could be adaptive rather than static, then moved through the evolution of ideas, the failed approaches, breakthrough insights, and the gradual construction of a system that could translate thought into action in real time. The presentation wasn't about NeuroDyne or Darren, or the board meeting. It was about the technical challenges of building neural interfaces that worked in the real world, the elegant solutions that emerged from months of patient problem-solving, and the difference between marketing claims and engineering reality. I recorded practice sessions, timing each section, and refining the technical explanations until they were clear enough for general audiences, but detailed enough for specialists. The presentation told the story of discovery, not through abstract concepts, but through specific examples, actual code snippets, and live demonstrations. By Wednesday, I had received another message from Eli Navarro, this time with an attachment. Thought you should see the original code application before Darren filed the simplified version. The document was a scanned copy of a patent draft, dated 8 months earlier, with 2 names listed as primary inventors, Darren Voss and Aria Lin. I stared at the document, realizing that Darren had intended to include me as co-inventor until something changed. His mind. The simplified version, filed 3 months later, listed only his name with a brief acknowledgement of supporting technical contributions from NeuroDyne development staff. The original draft proved that Darren had understood the collaborative nature of the work until he decided that collaboration was less valuable than sole ownership. It was the missing piece that connected his early encouragement of my documentation with his later systematic erasure of my contributions. Thursday morning brought news that the symposium presentation would be live-streamed to neural computing research groups worldwide, and that several major technology companies had requested advance copies of the technical specifications. I realized that my work would be visible to thousands of researchers, industry leaders, and potential competitors on the same day that NeuroDyne's board would be deciding whether Darren's technical leadership was sufficient for the company's future. Dr. Shiraz stopped by my workstation that afternoon. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked. "The presentation is ready," I said, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes after." "What do you think comes after?" Looked around NeuroDyne's office space at the glass walls and polished surfaces that had contained my work for 3 years, while keeping it invisible. Either Darren convinces the board that technical depth doesn't matter as much as strategic vision, I said, or the board realizes that strategy without technical understanding is just expensive marketing, and if it's the second option, then everything changes, I said, not just for me, but for how NeuroDyne approaches technical innovation and intellectual property. She nodded once. "Kao asked me to tell you that regardless of tomorrow's outcomes, NeuroDyne values technical excellence and wants to ensure that excellent work is properly recognized." It wasn't a promise exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that the conversation had moved beyond personalities and politics to questions about how innovation actually happened, and deserved credit for making it happen. That night, I received a voice message from my brother Kavi. "Heard about your big presentation tomorrow," his voice warm with pride. "Remember what Dad used to say, the truth doesn't need permission to be true. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it." I say the message, planning to listen to it again before tomorrow's presentation, not for courage but for the reminder that some things were more important than corporate politics or career advancement. The work itself, the problems solved, the systems built, and the simple satisfaction of creating something
that hadn't existed before Friday.
would bring visibility, whether I was ready for it or not. The International Neural Computing Symposium felt different from NeuroDyne's glass towers, warmer somehow, despite being held in Chicago's newest convention center. The auditorium, filled with 15 researchers, industry leaders, and graduate students who understood that neural interfaces represented the next fundamental shift in human-computer interaction. I stood backstage, listening to the murmur of conversations in 6 languages as people settled into their seats. My presentation materials were loaded and tested, but my hands remained steady around the small aluminum case containing the prototype that had started everything. 3 years ago, the device looked the same, unremarkable, and precise, but today, it would tell its own story. Dr. Vasquez introduced me with a brief biography that mentioned my doctoral work at MIT, but focused on breakthrough contributions to adaptive neural translation systems. She didn't mention NeuroDyne or Darren, or the corporate context that had brought me here, just the technical work and its implications for the field. I walked onto the stage and looked out at an audience that included researchers whose papers I had read, professors whose courses I had studied online, and executives from companies that were racing to solve the same problems I had been working on alone in my apartment for 3 years. Neural interfaces have promised to bridge the gap between human thought and digital action. For decades, I began my voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system, but most approaches have focused on training humans to communicate with machines, rather than training machines to understand humans. I opened the aluminum case and lifted out the prototype. What you're about to see represents a different approach, I said. Instead of requiring users to learn specific mental commands or maintain precise focus states, this interface adapts continuously to individual neural patterns, learning and evolving with each interaction. I placed the headband carefully and felt the familiar pressure of sensors against my temples. The interface requires no calibration period, no training phase, and no conscious effort from the user, I said. It simply translates natural thought patterns into digital commands. The auditorium fell silent as I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at the large display screen behind me, without speaking or moving. I thought the command to activate the presentation system. The screen flickered to life, showing a real-time visualization of my neural activity, presentation mode, and the display shifted to show the technical architecture of the interface. 3-dimensional models rotating in space. As my thoughts guided the presentation through its sections, gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. But I continued thinking through the presentation, letting the interface demonstrate its capabilities by responding to complex navigational commands, detailed technical queries, and even abstract conceptual requests. The key breakthrough was recognizing that neural patterns aren't static, they're dynamic, contextual, and highly individual, I said aloud while simultaneously thinking commands that brought up code snippets, architectural diagrams, and performance metrics. Traditional interfaces try to impose standardized patterns, but this system learns to recognize and interpret the user's natural thought processes. I navigated through 3 years of development documentation showing the evolution from early prototypes to the current system, each section controlled entirely through thought, while I spoke about the technical challenges and solutions that had emerged through iterative testing. Load simulation data, I thought, and the screen displayed performance charts showing the interface operating under various stress conditions. User adaptation curves brought up graphs demonstrating how quickly the system learned to interpret new users. Error recovery protocols revealed the safeguards that prevented dangerous failures. 15 minutes into the presentation, I realized that something had shifted in the auditorium. The initial amazement had settled into focused attention as researchers began to understand not just what they were seeing, but how it worked. The questions that followed would be technical, detailed, and impossible to answer without deep understanding of the underlying systems. Now I'd like to show you something that demonstrates the real-world implications of adaptive neural translation, I said, thinking the command to load a new presentation module. Live problem solving. The screen displayed a complex optimization problem, the kind of mathematical challenge that typically required multiple software tools and careful manual input. I looked at the problem for a moment, then began thinking through the solution. The interface translated my thought processes into code changes, algorithmic adjustments, and iterative testing. In real time, the audience watched as the optimization problem solved itself, guided by thoughts that were translated into computational actions, without any physical input devices or voice commands, just the direct connection between human reasoning and digital processing. The solution emerged through a collaboration between human intuition and computational power, I said, as the final results appeared on screen. But the collaboration happened at the speed of thought, not the speed of typing or clicking. I removed the headband and set it carefully back in its case. This technology isn't just about controlling computers more efficiently, I said. It's about creating new forms of human-computer collaboration, where the boundary between thinking and doing becomes permeable. The applause started slowly, then built into something that felt like recognition, not just of the demonstration, but of the years of work that had made it possible. When the questions began, they were exactly what I had hoped for: technical, specific, and focused on implementation details rather than marketing implications. How does the adaptive algorithm handle neural pattern drift over time? Asked a researcher from Stanford. What's the latency between thought initiation and system response? Came from someone at Google DeepMind. Can multiple users share interface access simultaneously? From a team at Ether. Each question required detailed understanding of the system's architecture, and I answered them with the confidence of someone who had built every component, personally, who had debugged every edge case, and who had spent months optimizing performance under real-world conditions. 40 minutes of questions revealed the depth of documentation and testing that had gone into the system. But more importantly, they revealed that the work was being taken seriously by people who understood its implications, not as a parlor trick or laboratory curiosity, but as a fundamental advancement in human-computer interaction. As the session ended, Dr. Vasquez approached the stage. That was remarkable, said. We've had requests from 12 research groups for collaboration opportunities, and 6 companies asking about licensing discussions. I looked out at the audience where people were still clustered in small groups discussing what they had seen. Several researchers had approached the stage asking for copies of technical specifications, and 3 venture capital firms had left business cards with requests for follow-up meetings. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Shures, watching the live stream from NeuroDyne's conference room. The board is very impressed. KO wants to speak with you immediately after your return. Another message from Eli Navarro. Saw the presentation. Beautiful work. The patent applications should have your name first. And then, unexpectedly, a message from an unknown number. This is Darren. Watched your presentation. We need to talk. I stood on the stage, looked out at 1,500 people who now knew that adaptive neural translation was not just possible but practical, not just theoretical but implemented, and not just a corporate marketing claim, but the result of years of careful technical work by someone who understood the problems well enough to solve them. The visibility I had never sought was now undeniable, but more importantly, the work itself was finally visible, not hidden behind corporate presentations or attributed to strategic leadership, but standing on its own technical merits. Tomorrow would bring conversations with KO, with Darren, the board, and with my own future, but today had been about something simpler: the satisfaction of sharing work that mattered with people who could understand its significance. I packed the prototype back into its aluminum case and walked off the stage, knowing that everything that happened next happened in a world where my work was no longer invisible. Monday morning at NeuroDyne felt like the aftermath of an earthquake. Everything looked the same, but the structural integrity had fundamentally changed. The neural interface system failures had cascaded over the weekend, affecting 12 region deployments and triggering emergency shutdowns that left thousands of users without access to critical functionality. I arrived to find Dr. Shuri's waiting by my workstation with a stack of printed error reports and an expression that mixed urgency with something that looked like vindication. "Exactly what your technical assessment predicted," she said. "Cascade failures starting in the handoff core module, spreading through the load balancing systems, and overwhelming the safe mode processing capacity. How bad?" "Bad enough that our stock price dropped 11% in pre-market trading," she said. "Bad enough that KO called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. Bad enough that 3 major clients are threatening contract cancellations." I pulled up the error logs on my workstation and saw the pattern I had documented playing out in real time. The system was failing randomly but systematically, following the exact sequence I had warned about in my analysis. The missing adaptive threshold calculations were creating bottlenecks that cascaded into complete regional failures. "Where's Darren?" "In his office with the engineering team trying to implement emergence patches." "Dr. Shuri's that they're treating symptoms, not causes. They don't understand why the failures are happening in this specific pattern." I looked at the error signatures scrolling across my screen, each one a confirmation of technical predictions that had been ignored, dismissed as academic overreach by someone who didn't understand the difference between managing a system and building one. My phone rang with an internal extension. Darren's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Aria, I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation that requires your expertise." I found Darren surrounded by 6 engineers, all staring at laptops displaying cascading error messages. His usual polish had been replaced by the kind of focused intensity that emerged when marketing confidence met engineering reality. "The failures are following the pattern you described in your assessment." Without preamble, "We need the adaptive threshold restoration you outlined, but the implementation is more complex than our team anticipated." "How complex?" "The original architecture appears to be more sophisticated than our current documentation indicates," one of the engineers said. "We're finding references to algorithms and safeguards that aren't present in the production codebase." I understood immediately. They were discovering the difference between my original design and the simplified version that had been implemented without my involvement. Like finding a building that had constructed from blueprints with critical structural elements removed. "How long do we have?" Darren asked. "Regional failures are cascading at approximately 4-hour intervals," another engineer said. "If the pattern continues, we'll have complete system failure across all deployments by Thursday." Darren looked at me directly. "Can you fix this?" "Yes," I said, "but it requires restoring components that were simplified out of the current implementation and rebuilding integration points that were modified without understanding their function." "How long?" 48 hours with full access to the codebase and authority to implement changes without review committee approval." Darren's pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Done," he said. "Whatever you need." I spent the next 2 days rebuilding 3 years of elegant solutions that had been replaced with brute force approaches, restoring algorithms that had been simplified into static thresholds and reintegrating safeguards that had been removed. Improved processing speed. Each restored component revealed how much sophistication had been lost in translation. By Wednesday evening, the system failures had stopped, the cascade pattern was broken, and the error logs showed the kind of stable performance that came from proper architecture, rather than emergency patches. The regional deployments came back online one by one, and the crisis that had threatened NeuroDyne's entire neural interface division was resolved. Thursday morning brought the emergency board meeting that would determine whether Darren's technical leadership was sufficient for NeuroDyne's future. The conference room filled with the same 12 directors who had watched him dismiss my presentation a week earlier, but the energy was different now, focused on results rather than presentations. Howe opened the meeting with a direct question. Mr. Voss, could you explain how the system failures were resolved? Darren stood at the head of the table, but his usual confidence was replaced by something more careful, more precise. The failures were caused by architectural complexity that required restoration of original design components, he said. Miss Line's technical analysis proved accurate, and her implementation approach resolved the cascading issue. And these original design components, Director Kelman asked, they were part of the system's initial development. Yes, Darren said, but they had been simplified during production optimization. Simplified by whom? Darren's pause was barely perceptible. By the development team during the transition from prototype to production deployment. Kawa's voice cut through the explanation with surgical precision. According to the technical documentation, you personally designed these systems. Mr. Voss, why would your team simplify components that you knew were critical? The room went quiet. Darren's face remained composed, but something in his posture suggested he was beginning to understand that the conversation had moved beyond crisis management to fundamental questions about technical ownership and responsibility. Complex systems often require optimization during deployment, he said. The original architecture included safeguards that appeared redundant under controlled testing conditions, but proved essential under real-world deployment. Kawa said, the kind of real-world conditions that Miss Lin anticipated in her original design. She had moved from questioning Darren's crisis response to questioning his understanding of the system itself, and the difference was becoming obvious to everyone in the room. Miss Lin, Kawa said, turning to me, in your assessment, the failures were predictable based on the architectural modifications that had been made to the original design. I said, the cascade pattern was a direct result of removing adaptive threshold calculations that were designed to prevent exactly this type of failure. And you had documented these safeguards in the original system design extensively. I said, along with the specific failure modes that would occur if they were simplified or removed. Cal looked back at Darren. If these safeguards in their documentation existed, why weren't they preserved during production optimization? Darren's answer came slowly, carefully. The optimization process focused on performance metrics, rather than edge case. Handling the documentation review may not have captured all of the original design intent, may not have captured design intent for a system you personally designed. Kawa said, or the design intent wasn't accessible to the optimization team. The distinction was subtle but devastating. It was the difference between admitting to oversight and admitting to fundamental misunderstanding of the system's architecture. Chairwoman Cow, Director Martinez, said, who has the authority to implement architectural changes to NeuroDyne's core neural interface systems. Going forward, Cow said, Ms. Lan have full authority over neural interface architecture and development. As the newly appointed Director of Neural Systems Engineering, the title was delivered without fanfare or discussion, just the simple acknowledgement that technical authority should belong to someone who understood the technology well enough to fix it when it broke. Darren remained standing at the head of the table, but something in his expression suggested that he understood the conversation was over. Not just the meeting, but his role as the technical authority behind NeuroDyne's most important innovation. Cow closed meeting with a single directive. Ms. Lan, please prepare a comprehensive technical roadmap for neural interface development over the next 5 years. We need to understand not just what we're building but who's building it. My new office felt strange at first, too large, too formal, with windows that looked out over the same Chicago skyline I had watched from my apartment during 3 years of late-night development work, but the door had my name on it. Aria Lin, Director of Neural Systems Engineering, and for the first time in years my title matched my actual responsibilities. I was organizing technical specifications. When the envelope arrived hand-delivered by someone from the executive floor, My name written in careful handwriting across cream-colored paper that felt expensive between my fingers. Inside was a single sheet covered in the same careful handwriting. Aria, it began. This letter won't change anything, and I'm not writing it expecting forgiveness or understanding. I'm writing it because some things need to be said, even when it's too late to matter. Darren's confession filled 3 pages, dense with admissions that he had never made aloud. Not to the board, not to me, not even to himself. I knew from the beginning that you were the architect of the neural interface system. He wrote every breakthrough, every elegant solution, every innovation that made the technology actually work, came from your mind, your persistence, your willingness to solve problems that couldn't even fully understand. He described the moment when he realized that he could take credit for work he hadn't done it. It started small, he wrote, rephrasing your technical updates for board presentations, emphasizing strategic direction over technical implementation, but each time it became easier to position myself as the visionary behind innovations that you had actually created. The letter detailed 3 years of systematic erasure, not through malice but through weakness. I told myself I was protecting the project by ensuring it had visible leadership. He wrote, I convinced myself that your work needed my strategic guidance to reach its potential, but the truth is simpler and more pathetic. I was afraid that admitting your technical superiority would diminish my own value to the company. He wrote about the patent applications, the board presentations, the moments when he could have acknowledged my contributions, but chose instead to reinforce the fiction that he was the primary innovator. Each lie required additional lies to maintain. He wrote until the fabrication became so complex that admitting the truth felt impossible. The most painful section described his calculation about my reaction. I believed you would value the work itself more than recognition for the work. He wrote, I thought your satisfaction came from solving problems, not from being credited with solutions. I was wrong about your priorities, but more importantly, I was wrong about the difference between creating something and claiming credit for its creation. He acknowledged what the board meeting had made obvious: when the system failed, I couldn't fix it because I had never built it. He wrote, I could describe its functions and market its capabilities, but when it broke, I needed you to repair something that you had designed and I had never truly understood. The humiliation wasn't just professional. It was personal recognition that my entire technical reputation was borrowed. The letter ended with something that felt like genuine regret. You deserved recognition for work that changed how humans interact with computers. He wrote, instead you got 3 years of invisibility while someone else received applause for your innovations. I can't return those years or undo the damage to your career trajectory, but I can finally acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning. The neural interface technology belongs to you, not because a board meeting assigned you authority but because you created it. He had signed it simply, Darren, without titles or corporate affiliation, just his name, acknowledging accountability for choices that had diminished both of us in different ways. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a desk drawer labeled Archive, not because I was ready to forgive but because some admissions deserved preservation, even when they came too late to repair the damage they acknowledged that afternoon. I received a message from Dr. How does it feel to have your name on the door? Strange, I replied, but appropriate. The board approved your technical roadmap. She wrote, full authority over neural interface development, unlimited research budget, and a team of 12 senior engineers who actually understand what they're building. It wasn't vindication exactly, because vindication implied that the truth had been in doubt, but it was restoration, the return of authority to someone who had earned it through years of patient work, rather than strategic positioning. My phone buzzed with a text from Kavi. Saw the news about your promotion. Dad would be proud. He was right. My father had always believed that good work would eventually find recognition, but he had never specified the timeline or guaranteed that recognition would come before retirement or regret. I had been fortunate enough to see truth emerge while I was still young enough to build on it. That evening I sat in my new office reviewing technical specifications for projects that would build on the foundation I had laid 3 years ago. but this time my name would be attached, not hidden in metadata or buried in revision logs, but visible in the way that mattered most as the person responsible for what came next. I opened a new document and began outlining the next generation of neural interface technology, not as a response to corporate pressure or market demands, but as the natural evolution of ideas that had been growing in careful isolation. Years the work itself hadn't changed. I was still solving problems that required patient iteration, careful testing, and the willingness to rebuild solutions that almost worked into solutions that actually worked, but now the work was visible in the way that work should be visible through results that carried the name of the person who created them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new systems to build, but tonight was for the quiet satisfaction of seeing truth align with reality and understanding, for the first time in years, that visibility and value could coexist. Letter from Darren remained in the drawer, not forgotten, but not forgiven either, just preserved as evidence that some people eventually recognized the difference between creating something and claiming credit for its creation. Even when recognition came too late to matter. 6 months later, I stood in a laboratory that had been designed according to my specifications. Natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminating workbenches arranged for collaboration rather than hierarchy. The space felt different from NeuroDyne's glass towers, warmer, more human, despite housing some of the most sophisticated neural interface technology on the planet. The plaque outside the lab read, "The Line Institute for Neurocomputational Ethics," a research division that had emerged from the board's recognition that technical innovation required not just engineering expertise but careful consideration of how humans and machines should interact. The institute reported directly to Chairwoman Ko, with independence to pursue research that prioritized human benefit over commercial application. Hollis AI, 1 initialization sequence complete. The voice came from speakers embedded invisible in the lab ceiling, clean and precise without the artificial warmth that most systems used to mask their digital nature. "Good morning, Aria." I looked up from the diagnostic display where real-time neural activity patterns scrolled in elegant waves. The new system had learned to recognize my thought patterns with an accuracy that approached perfect understanding, not through brute force processing, but through patient observation of how human consciousness actually operated. "Morning, Hollis," I said aloud, then thought the command to display the overnight test results. "Show me the user adaptation data from the beta deployment." The air in front of me shimmered as holographic displays materialized, showing performance metrics from 12 test sites around the world. The system had processed neural inputs from 84,207 users across 6 languages, 4 cultural backgrounds and 3 age demographics, learning to interpret thought patterns that ranged from precise technical commands to abstract creative intentions. Adaptation time averaged 4.7 minutes, Hollis said, with 99.2% accuracy maintained across all user groups. Error rates decreased by 67% compared to previous generation interfaces. I smiled at the data not because it proved anything I hadn't expected, but because it represented the natural evolution of ideas that had been growing for years, each improvement building on careful observation of how humans actually thought rather than how engineers assumed they should think. The lab door opened and Dr. Shuris entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a tablet displaying the morning's research updates. "The MIT collaboration request came through," she said, handing me a cup. "They want to integrate Hollis into their neurorehabilitation program." "Full integration, or just consultation?" "Full partnership," she said. "They're offering joint research funding and shared publication credits. They specifically requested that you lead the technical development." It was the kind of opportunity I had dreamed about during my doctoral years, working with researchers who understood that neural interfaces could transform how humans recovered from brain injuries, interacted with assistive technologies, and explored the boundaries of human-computer collaboration. "There's more," Dr. Shuris continued. "Stanford called about the pediatric application study, and Caltech wants to discuss the consciousness mapping project." She settled into a chair beside my workstation. 6 universities, 12 research hospitals, and 4 international collaborations, all requesting technical leadership from someone who 6 months ago was invisible to the academic community. The irony wasn't lost on me, that visibility had come, not through corporate presentations or strategic positioning, but through the simple act of sharing work that mattered with people who could understand its significance. The symposium presentation had opened doors that I hadn't even known existed. My phone buzzed with a video message from Kavi standing in his high school classroom, with a group of students gathered around a display showing the Hollis interface, telling my ethics class about my sister who built machines that read minds. His grin was infectious. They want to know if you're hiring interns. I saved the message, planning to share it with the team later, not because it was professionally relevant, but because it reminded me that the work we were doing would eventually reach classrooms, laboratories, hospitals, and homes where people would use neural interfaces to solve problems that mattered to them. Aria, Hollis said. Incoming priority message from Chairwoman KO. The message appeared on my workstation screen, brief and direct. Board approved the 5-year research proposal. Funding increased to support international collaboration. Excellent work. The 5-year proposal had outlined a research agenda that prioritized human benefit over commercial application, exploring neural interfaces for accessibility, medical rehabilitation, creative expression, and educational enhancement. It was the kind of long-term thinking that corporate quarterly reports usually couldn't support, but KO had recognized that some innovations required patience. One more thing, Dr. Sharash said. Darren submitted his resignation this morning. I looked up from the research updates, surprised by my own lack of emotional response. Where is he going? Back to business development, said. A consulting firm that helps technology companies with strategic messaging. He'll be good at it. It was probably true. Darren's talent for translating technical concepts into marketing language had always been genuine, even when his understanding of the underlying technology wasn't. Our resignation felt less like victory than like the natural conclusion of a story that had been heading towards separation for years. That afternoon I received an email from Eli Navarro. With the subject line, "Full Circle," attached was a scanned document from the Patent Office. A revised filing listed me as the primary inventor of adaptive neural translation systems, with Darren's name removed entirely. Thought you should see this. Eli wrote, the Patent Office accepted the revision based on technical documentation and testimony from multiple witnesses, including Dr. Sharash and several engineers who confirmed authorship. The original work is now properly attributed. I printed the document and placed it in the same drawer where Darren's letter remained. Not because the patent mattered more than the work itself, but because legal recognition protected the work from future misattribution. It was insurance against the possibility that history might be rewritten again, by someone with louder voice and better marketing. Evening brought the ritual I had developed over the past 6 months, reviewing the day's progress while listening to recordings from the early development years. Tonight, I selected a voice memo from 3 years ago, recorded at 2:30 in the morning, after a breakthrough in signal processing, figured out why the interface was losing accuracy under stress. My younger voice said, exhausted but excited. It wasn't hardware limitation, it was adapt algorithm, trying to maintain static patterns instead of evolving with user stress response. If we let the system learn from stress instead of fighting it, we can actually improve performance under pressure. The insight had led to one of the interface's most elegant features, the ability to become more accurate as users became more emotionally engaged with their tasks. But listening to the recording reminded me of something more important. The satisfaction of solving problems that no one else understood, not for recognition or credit, but for the simple pleasure of making something work better. Interrupted my reflection with a gentle chime. Aria, you have a visitor at the main entrance. Eli Navarro. I found Eli in the institute's lobby, looking around with the expression of someone seeing a place they had helped create, but never expected to visit. Wanted to see what you built with all the archive documentation. He said. We walked through the lab together as I explained the research projects, the international collaborations, and the ethical framework that guided the Institute's work. Eli listened with the attention of someone who understood both the technical complexity and the institutional politics that had made the work possible. You know what's different about this place? He said as we paused beside the Hollis interface demonstration area. It feels like somewhere people actually build things instead of just talking about building things. He was right. The Institute, the energy of a place where problems were solved through patient work rather than strategic presentations, where technical decisions were made by people who understood the technology, and where credit belonged to the people who did the work. As Eli prepared to leave, he handed me a small package. Something I thought you should have, he said. Inside was a framed photograph of the original neural interface prototype sitting on my apartment coffee table 3 years ago beside a notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams. The image captured the moment when the work had been purely about solving problems without consideration of corporate politics or intellectual property. How did you get this? Took it the night you first showed me the working prototype, Eli said. Figured someday you might want to remember what it looked like when it was just yours. I looked at the photograph and saw not just the prototype but the apartment, the notebook, the late nights, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that hadn't existed before. The work had always been mine, but now the recognition was mine too, and more importantly, the authority to decide what came next. That night, I sat in my office reviewing proposals for next year's research agenda, neural interfaces for artistic expression systems that could translate emotions into visual art interfaces that could help children with autism communicate more effectively, technology that could restore agency to people who had lost physical mobility. Each proposal represented problems that mattered to real people who would benefit from solutions that prioritized human flourishing over commercial metrics. It was the kind of work that my father would have understood, not because he was an engineer but because he believed that their work should make life better for people who needed it. Hollis spoke softly as I prepared to leave. Aria, the overnight processing is complete. Shall I archive today's progress reports? Archive everything, I said with full metadata, timestamp signatures, and version control. Of course, documentation protocol remains comprehensive. I smiled at the response, not because it was programmed to be helpful, but because it represented the institutionalization of lessons learned through 3 years of systematic erasure. Some truths needed to be preserved with the kind of precision that made rewriting history impossible. Walking through the empty institute toward the elevator, I reflected on the path that had led from a grocery receipt sketch to an international research collaboration, from late-night problem-solving in my apartment to morning briefings with university presidents, from invisible technical contributions to recognized technical leadership. The work itself hadn't changed. I was still solving problems that required patience, iteration, and the willingness to rebuild solutions that almost worked into solutions that actually worked. But now the work was visible in the way that mattered most, through results that carried my name and authority, that reflected my expertise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new collaborations, new opportunities to build systems that helped humans and machines understand each other better. But tonight was for the quiet satisfaction, seeing truth and recognition finally aligned. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. My reflection multiplied in the polished steel walls. But this time, the image showed someone whose work was no longer invisible, someone whose authority matched their expertise, someone whose name appeared not buried in metadata, but displayed on doors, patents, research papers, and international collaboration agreements. Hollis's voice followed me into the elevator. Good night, Aria. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. Hollis, I said, and meant it. The truth had never needed permission to be true. It had just needed someone patient enough to document it, carefully enough to preserve it, and eventually brave enough to make it visible. Now it was, up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.